Hi theory students. Today we're going to be learning about fourth species counterpoint. This introduces the concepts of syncopation and accented dissonances. Rhythmic features. In fourth species, the counterpoint begins with a half rest and a half note. This half note is tied over to another half note, and so on until the cadence. So if we think about whole notes in the cantus, then what we get up above, half rest and a half note tied over, another half note tied over, another half note tied over, etc. So it's as though the cantus and counterpoint alternate notes, and because because the counterpoint initiates its notes on the upbeat, not the downbeat, that causes the so-called syncopation effect. The consonances and dissonances are the opposite of second species. Remember, in second species, the downbeats had to be consonant and the upbeats could be dissonant under certain circumstances. Now, in fourth species, the upbeats, in other words, when the counterpoint note starts, has to be consonant, and the downbeats can be consonant or dissonant. So that when you start a counterpoint note, it's consonant. When you tie it over and the cantus moves, you'll see whether it's consonant or dissonant. If the downbeat is dissonant, it must resolve down by step. This is called a suspension, and it has three parts. The preparation, where the note begins as a consonance before being tied over. The suspension, a dissonance on the downbeat. And the resolution, a consonance a step lower. Let me show you. So in this example, let's imagine that we have a tenth here on the upbeat. Just for argument's sake, let's say that we had a note that tied over to a D here to make an octave. So here's a tenth on the upbeat. That's consonant. I tie it over to another F, and now when the cantus moves, it forms a seventh, and that's dissonant. Because it's dissonant, the F must resolve down by step to an E, and that forms a consonance. If I tie this E over, it forms another seventh that's dissonant. It must resolve down by step to a consonance. So the suspension, that's a suspension, and so is that one because of the dissonance. It has three parts. The preparation, where the F starts, that's consonant. The suspension itself is an accented dissonance that's formed when the note ties over but the cantus moves to a note that's not consonant with it. And then the movement down by step to the consonants, that's the resolution. So preparation, consonant, suspension, dissonant, down by step as a resolution, and that's consonant. We label suspensions by the intervals they form with their resolutions. Upper counterpoints may use the 4-3, the 7-6, which we just saw in the example, or the 9/8 suspensions. Those are the intervals within the measure of the suspension. There's a strong preference for the 4/3 or the 7/6 because they resolve to imperfect consonances. If you use the 9/8 suspension, you can't precede the 9 with an 8 before it, or else it'll sound too much like parallel octaves. When we write a lower counterpoint, we can only use a 2/3 suspension, or its octave relation, the 9/10 suspension. The resolution to a perfect consonance, the 4/5 or the 7/8, is not used. Also, remember that since suspensions resolve down by step, lower counterpoints will not use the 4/3 or the 7/6 patterns. So imagine this is somewhere in the middle of a line, and that we're over here on a third. This is a lower counterpoint. I'm going to tie it over. It forms a second. That's a suspension. It resolves down by step to a third, and that's an acceptable suspension. We can have a situation here where it leads into a 7/8 suspension. We don't use that in the lower counterpoints, probably because they resolve to perfect consonances. Nor can we get out of this by taking that dissonance up instead of down. We don't do that either. So, a few other situations. What do we do if your syncopation moves to a consonance instead of a dissonance? What if you tie the note across the bar line and you get a third or a fifth or a sixth? You're free to move to another consonance as long as you're using a step or a consonant skip or leap, just like what we were doing with melodies before. Because suspensions tend to force a line to go down as you resolve them, when you do get the freedom to move, the tendency is to skip or leap up in order to create room for the next set of suspensions. A few odds and ends. The cadence has to end with a whole note tonic in the last measure, just as in the other species, and you have to precede this with a suspension resolving to the leading tone. If it's an upper counterpoint, it'll be a 7/6 suspension. If it's a lower counterpoint, it'll be a 2/3 suspension. And finally, breaking species. If tying a note over leads to a poor situation, an unacceptable suspension or more than 3 of the same suspensions in a row, or if we would dip below the cantus if we tie the note over, then you may do what we call breaking species by not tying the note over and moving to a new note across the bar line. This works like second species temporarily, so the downbeat must be consonant. Don't do this too often, or else the line will sound more like a second species than a fourth species exercise. But let me show you an example of breaking species. Here, in this cantus that starts that way, we start on an octave. If we tied this over and try to resolve that, we get something that we just can't allow. We can't allow a resolution to a dissonance, and even if that were a perfect fifth, we don't have 4/5 suspensions below. So here's a good circumstance where, because of what's going on, we are forced to break species. Just as if this were second species, we go to a consonance on the downbeat And now we are free to move to another consonance. So now if I go there, tie that over, and have the 2-3 suspension, tie that over, I'm on a sixth and I'm free to move to another consonance on the upbeat. So this is one good reason here to break species. So here's the example, and I actually built a problem into it so you could see how we solve this. So we start and continue. If I want to go up, we're good so far, but now we're in trouble. I can't resolve there because I want to get into the 7/6 suspension at the end. So I have to go back to where I started getting into trouble and rethink how I'm going to get to that C. Here, if I go down to the 6th and tie it over for a 5th, where I really want to be is over here, so that I could start the 7/6 suspensions at the end. If I wanted to, I guess I could break species also by possibly going to the A over here and the G over there, which are a third above the F and the E, and then going up to the C. Although this is probably better because I'm doing it without breaking species. So now the ending from this octave having 2 or 3 of the same suspensions in a row is called a chain. This is good up to a point. You shouldn't do more than 3 of these in a row of the same pattern. So this is a good fourth species exercise. The things to remember are to resolve your suspensions down by step, and then when you get into a situation that you can't use, then it's time to break species and pretend momentarily that you're in second species and then get back into the syncopations. That's all for today.